Big love. Okay, so I'm just arriving. Nobody's here yet. Literally just stepped into the room. And I'm going to chill for a few moments. Let's get ready. This is going to be a cool little discussion, I think. I'm quite psyched for it, really, to be honest. So we'll get the mic adjusted. Yeah, I think that's about perfect. And get everything just about ready. Don't normally do lives at this time of day. And so it's a trial by fire, shall we say. Let me get myself into the perfect position. I think it's pretty damn perfect, if you ask me. That's pretty damn perfect. Let's admit it. Let's just say it's the best. It's the best. The best Bush Whisperer can get. Yeah, so, Gnosticism. It's a totally blown out of proportion topic. Everything has been completely twisted. The texts, the meanings of the texts, the actual group, the size of the group, who were and weren't Gnostics, the interpretation of the meaning of the word Gnostic has been psyoped, has been occulted. It started with the church fathers. And so what we're going to do is we're going to dive through this. We're going to swim right through this. Namaste. I see there's a few of you arriving. Big love. Peace, blessings. Hope you guys are having a great day. We're going to dive through a couple of these different sects to give us an insight into just exactly what was Gnosticism, where did it come from. You've all been fed some pile of BS from youngsters on TikTok and YouTube shorts and people that have read the propaganda. And that's really important for you to grasp. What you've been taught is what propaganda was created by the enemies of the Gnostics. And that's what you've all been hearing. You haven't heard from the Gnostics themselves. You haven't heard what their interpretations of their texts are. You've heard what the early Christian forefathers' interpretations of the Gnostic texts were, as if it's the gospel. There's that word again, as if it's the truth. And so all these people that are talking nonsense about Gnosticism, they need to catch a wake-up call. They need to do it fast because they are part of the problem. It's all good and well to hear about the Iranian government from the perspective of the Americans, right? It's all good and well to hear about the Palestinians from the perspective of the Zionist government, right? But do you hear the truth? When the Israeli government speaks about the Palestinians, do they speak the truth? When the Iranian government creates propaganda about the Americans, do they speak the truth? When the Americans create propaganda about the Iranians and the Iraqis and the Chinese, do they speak the truth? Have you noticed how many differing opinions there are with regards to this modern dilemma we find ourselves in the geopolitical circus? Now, I want us to step back 2,000 years and take a look at exactly everything that you think you know about Gnosticism, everything you've heard about Gnosticism, what you believe it is, what you believe the pretexts are, that the world is evil. Who were the first Gnostics, right? Where the Gnosis actually originate from? Let's start with the word, right? Gnosis means to know. It's often interpreted as intellectualism or knowledge. No, it's more of an act of knowing, What's the difference between knowledge and the act of knowing? Well, the knower, right? Knowledge is something that you can record and say that is knowledge. Somebody at some point was a knower and they put down that knowledge, crystallized it. But the act of knowing is an act of expansive awareness, grasping truth. And it's a principle. It's a fundamental principle. And so the baseline of what Gnosticism is and what Gnosticism represents can be summarized in a very short line. And Emmanuel, who people call Jesus, did so frequently. And I'll quote him. He said, "The kingdom of truth is within you. The kingdom of heaven is within you." What does this really mean? It means that the entire spiritual domain is within us. What does that mean? Well, as above, so below. Everything that is in the material world is within the spiritual domain. You can find the knowledge of anything in the world by looking within yourself. This is also a core precept in shamanism. Wow. So now we're connecting dots between shamanism and gnosis. Why? Because the shaman is going into themselves to connect with the spiritual hierarchies and gain a direct experience of profound knowledge. Knowledge that can be brought into the physical world to help the community, to direct, to heal. Often these archetypal beings will work through the shaman. We call them psychopomps, but that's a little bit of it's a bad term. So let's just uncover, let's take Gnosis and let's undress her. Let's get her naked the way Sophia meant her to be. Because this knowledge of Gnosis is something that's rather fundamental to understanding the history behind Gnosticism. So what we have is we have this modern interpretation of Gnosticism, which was like, well, they believed that the world was evil and that the material world was bad. That's what the Christian forefathers said about the Gnostics. Why? Because the Gnostics didn't condemn the world. They condemned the creator of this world. There's a fundamental difference. Let me give you an example. Let's say you've got a table in your home, and it's a really beautiful table that was made by one of the best table makers in the world that happened to be a pedophile. I want you to digest that for a moment. The man who made the table was evil, and he was making the table so that he could sell the tables to make money to buy children. Does that mean that the table's badly made? Or does it mean that the association of the table with the maker of the table has a problematic history? But the actual table might be a work of art. Maybe he was a really good carpenter and he only made the best tables out of the best cuts of wood, right? So the world is not what the Gnostics were talking about. They were talking about the false god, the false creator. So when we look at this, we really need to go right back to the beginning. And going right back to the beginning is uncovering the lies of Christianity, the lies of the Christian Brotherhood. Oh yeah, baby, this is going to get juicy. So we will often be told by our modern scholars, and I want to point out that there are a lot of idiosyncrasies that we can observe with the modern scholars that do not add up, right? Example, you happen to be an eyewitness to a car robbery, right? And you told John about that car robbery. And 3 years later, John told Mary. Mary wrote it down in her own words, which was read by Paul 30 years later. Paul, after reading Mary's words, Paul's first language wasn't English. It was his second language. Did his best to interpret what Mary said and repeated those words to somebody called George, who told somebody else 15 years later. I want you to follow this line of inquiry. Now, 20 years later, a bunch of researchers uncover the story and they say that your eyewitness testimony has no validity. but that the chain of information that has passed through the broken telephone has more validity 60 years down the line when someone is talking about something that they were told by somebody who was told something by somebody who read a note in their second language written by someone else years ago, who had been told about something, who had been told about something, who had been told by yourself. And then those people would say that your ideas are wrong, and the person ideas right down the end of the line is more valid than yours. This is what modern scholars have been doing. I want you to appreciate the texture of the lie, right? So if we go back 2,000 years to the time, or almost 2,000 years, to the time that the Gnostics were rampagely developing, right? And I'll give you an example. For example, 150 AD, there were how many Gnostics? There were how many Christians, right? So it's estimated that there were 40,000 Christians in the Roman Empire in 150 AD. Did you know that? 40,000. It's also estimated how many Gnostics there were. And the Gnostics were Christians. And guess what the number is? Guess what? We're talking at least 35,000. And guess who those 35,000 people were? They were mostly Marcionites. So Marcionism was the flavor of Christianity. And I want you to appreciate what we're talking about here, the scale of what we're saying. What we're saying is that most early Christians were Gnostics. If not most, all. There were some small little sects. For example, let's pull up a couple of slides here, because I think this is going to be useful for us. How big was the Jewish sect? Okay, let's do this. Let's do this. So we are told by our scholars, and the reason we need to do this is we need to get a grasp of just exactly what we're being told and what the meaning is. Right? So the Jewish sect that made up only a small fraction of this, totally numbering a low thousands. Right? I want you to digest that, because it's going to be relevant. Right? Okay. Now, what have we got here? I want you to understand just how much lies you're being fed by the so-called academics. Take a look at the screen. What do you see? This is typical. You can go and research this, by the way. I'm just using this as a base for you to be able to see what you can go and research yourself, and you can go and take a look and see, there are a lot of writings that confirm these numbers, and these are validated by numerous historians and anthropologists. So they will tell you the typical doctrine that we are going to hear is that a Jewish sect during the 1st century was propagating these teachings. Okay. And this was during the 1st century, during the latter part. If you research it, you'll see during the latter part of the 1st century. Because remember, Emmanuel's life was passed over in 30, or just close to 33 CE, whatever. Then the disciples all split up. Then there was all of these Roman incursions. So over the next 30, 40 years, it became sort of, Christianity started to get a bit more of a presence, but it wasn't called Christianity. So we're told that it originated as a Jewish sect in Judea. Right. Okay. So this is the story. This is supposedly after 33 CE, because that was the crucifixion. Right. Then it's telling us that 313 CE, Emperor Constantine issued an edict of Milan legalizing Christianity and ending centuries of Rome persecution. I like the way they say legalizing Christianity. And this isn't going to be a lecture on Christianity, by the way, but we need to understand what Gnosticism is and where it comes from. And in order to understand this, we need to understand what Christianity is and where that came from, because there's going to be a very surprising revelation as we move through this information, right? So 325 CE, that was the Council of Nicaea. Okay, that's a really important date for you to be bearing, because that has got to do with the formal introduction of all of the church masters coming together, and they were sort of politically manipulated by Constantine. And he used very clever tactics. In other words, it was done in such a fashion as like, if you were in alignment with what his desires were, you got given a place near the front of the meeting, and you were ensured to get his attention and his money. And you would be getting big churches built in prominent places so that your church could thrive. If you were not in alignment with Constantine's values and ideas, you were put at the back of the building, largely ignored, and forget about getting much funding to build a church because it's not coming your way. That was really essentially what was happening. As always, there was political maneuverings behind what Constantine was doing, because at the end of the day, Constantine was very much a politician. So let's go back for a moment. So we're looking at, and what we mentioned just a moment ago was that a Jewish sect in Judea during the first century. So we're talking essentially after 33 AD, going towards the end of the first century, but they didn't really have a big presence. They didn't have a big presence, apparently. Now, here's where the numbers start to become fudged. I want you to look at the next little piece of information. So the Jewish Christian sect made up only a small fraction of this number, numbering in low thousands. I think the numbers go as far as the estimated between 1,800 to 2,500 people out of 40 to 100,000 Christians. So there were 40 to 100,000 Christians, and I want you to understand that most of them, 60% of the population of the Roman Empire, was in eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. For those of you that don't know, you can go and double check everything I'm saying. This is legit. And majority of the Christians were in those provinces. There was some small movements of Christianity in the western provinces, but the western provinces had more pagan values than the Christian values, which were more the eastern provinces, which included the so-called Holy Land and, and beyond. Egypt and such would have been part of these provinces, for example. So there's an idea that you can test for yourself. Go and look it up, please. Don't take my word for it. So what they're saying to us, that in about AD 50, there was like maybe 1,000, right? Maybe 1,000. I believe there was like maybe 1,000 Jewish Christians. And like 70, 80, 90, 100 years later, there was still only just a few thousand of them left. However, there was 40 to 100,000 Christians. Do you see how much nonsense it is that the Jewish Christian sect was really where Christianity originated from? Understanding that the teachings went far and wide. All the disciples and all those that have been in contact with Emmanuel had taken the teachings immediately far and wide. The Jewish people, by large, denied Emmanuel. And Emmanuel specifically challenged the Jewish tradition when he made statements like, you don't put new wine into an old container, because new wine will split an old container. You don't mix new wine with old wine. You put new wine in a new container and you leave the old wine in its old container. This is like one of the talks that he delivers when he's speaking specifically about his teachings in relation to Judaism, because people ask him about his teachings and how his teachings are different to the teachings of Moses and the Jewish law. And so there's his little answer. And that answer is quite telling. What he's saying is, I bring a new teaching. Don't mix up my teachings with the old Judaic things. My teachings are my teachings. Those teachings are those teachings. You can't put my teachings in those old box. It'll break the box, is what he's saying. When he says, my teachings is the new wine, you put the new wine with the old box of the old wine, and the old wine bag will split. And you can't mix the new wine and the old wine. This is what he's saying. So for you to understand just how the PSYOP has worked, now let's look at Gnosticism. So 40,000 to 100,000, they say, was the total global Christian population. Now, I want you to understand that there were also Christians in the Iranian place. In the Iranian, there were Christians far and wide, right? So now we're going to take a look at the Gnostics for a moment, right? And we're going to sort of like look at what we can discover about the Gnostic tradition. And I think that this is going to be really very, very, very telling, right? And just to be clear, in 150 AD, Christians made up 0.07 to 0.1% of the total Roman Empire, right? And so the most scholars agree that we're talking more like 40,000 people out of 60 million people, right? That's just something for you to consider for a moment. Now, we're going to talk about the eastern and the western parts. Now, Gnosticism was thriving in the eastern parts of the Roman Empire. This is something else that you want to consider very carefully and very closely. Now, 70% of the entire Roman Empire's population was in the Eastern Empire's side, right? 42 to 56 million people out of 60 to 80 million people were in the eastern provinces. This is what the archaeology shows, the demographics. And that's quite important for you to bear around 70%, right? And these major hubs are like Anatolia, Egypt, the Levant. And this was the hub of the Roman Empire, financially and economically as well. Another really important piece of information. Now, when we go further afield, there were Christian sects, Gnostic sects that were thriving, and we will cover one of them in a little while, in the Parthian Empire and in the Persian Empire. We're talking about another 8 to 15 million people, right? And that's something to also consider, right? The Parthian Empire is what we would consider the Western Persia, right? Western Persian lands. And Christianity in those places was synonymous with Marcionism. And now this name Marcion is going to come up extensively. And we're going to look at just exactly how much propaganda was made by the church about Marcion, and just exactly who Marcion was, what were the teachings of Marcionism, and is that very close to the root of Gnosticism. We're then going to look at all the other different Gnostic offshoots and how they were related to Marcionism, right down to the Cathars, and how the church had been fighting this bloody war against the Gnostics for centuries. And every time they stumped them out, they would pop up under a different label. Now, another thing I want to point out to you is what we speak of when we speak of Gnosticism. There wasn't an official label of Gnosticism, right? This is not how it was. there were various different Gnostic peoples in various different groups. And we're going to look at those specific groups that many of the modern scholars are confused about. Some say they were Gnostic, some say they were not Gnostic. The woke scholars tend to say they were not Gnostic. The scholars that are actually tapping from the older scholars that were legit back in the older times, they acknowledge that Gnosticism was running through all these different sects. So let's dive a little deeper. Let's take a little bit of a look at this. So we're going to look to begin with Marcionism, right? But before we get to Marcionism, let's get to let's get to Marcionism. Do I have some texts here on Marcionism? Maybe I'm not. Okay, so there are many sects that started. Let's go to Marcionism. Let's do it. Marcionism. Let's see what we're going to find them saying about Marcionism, right? So they'll say that Marcionism and Gnosticism. Do you find that interesting? Oh, Marcionism and Gnosticism were dualistic second century Christian heresies that distinguished between the God of the Old Testament and the supreme God of Jesus. Okay. So notice they're called heresies. Let's take one step further, right? When was Marcionism, I want you to understand what's been done, declared a heresy? So Marcionism, right, was excommunicated, and his teachings were officially condemned as a heresy by the church in Rome in 144 CE. Right. But hold a moment. Which church? Because the Christian church was only formalized 150 years later. So which church declared him a heretic? And why was it not formalized? He wasn't formally a heretic. He was only formalized as a heretic in 325 by the emperor when the Council of Nicaea happened. In fact, there's a lot of evidence to point out that the reason the Council of Nicaea happened was largely due to Marcionism. So let's take a look at what Marcionism is, right? The Marcion Bible. The Marcion Bible is the original Bible, right? The Marcion Bible. There's two books, right? There's two books of the Marcion Bible. And let's see if we can. Yeah. So there's the Apostolicon, right? Which is Galatians 1 and 2 Corinthians, Romans 1 and 2 Thessalonians, right? Laodiceans, Colossians, Philemon, and the Philippians, right? And basically, Paul was considered to be the true apostle, and the teachings of Paul were the closest by the Marcion tradition to the truth of the original teachings of God. So Marcionism was most definitely a Christian organization. I want you to understand this. They were Christians through and through, right? They called themselves followers of Christ. They read a Bible. Marcion in the 100s compiled the first original canon. That original canon was used extensively by all the other churches. I want you to appreciate what I'm saying here, right? And the Marcions texts were basically the texts largely that were used for the New Testament 200 years later. However, the texts of Marcionism were all written between 50 AD, 45 AD, and 70 AD. There's two books. Two books of Marcion texts. What was the other one called? The one was the Evangelion, and the other one was the Apostolicon, right? So these were the, notice what they say here, an edited version of the Gospel of Luke. Right. So what they're telling us is that Marcion edited the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke that they're talking about is a gospel that was written centuries later. I want you to grasp this. Centuries later, the church took Marcion's texts, extracted the original Proto-Luke text, edited it, and then accused Marcion of editing those texts 200 years prior. In fact, Marcion didn't edit the text. The texts that Marcion got came from 50 to 70 AD. So they are claiming that the original texts from 50 to 70 AD are the edited texts, and the book of Luke that was later 325 AD plus, recognized as the official text of Luke, was the unedited version. Now tell me at this point, are any of you smelling the bullshit? Please. Tell me you can smell it. Tell me it's getting really obvious what's going on here. So what happened was Marcion was heavily attacked. Now, just to be clear, right? Let's take this. Let me show you what I'm talking about, just so we've got clarity, right? When were the texts actually penned? Notice I use my search term carefully. The Marcion used. You see, Google wants to give us all sorts of another. Now they're telling us it's 130 to 140 CE. No, they were used in the mid-2nd century by the teacher Marcion. They were published in his Bible, in his canon. When were they penned? Right? When were the apocryphal? Maybe I should write that. No. When were the biblical penned? They should be able to. There we go. There we go, people. So now you see how Google AI is trying to mislead us. And it's because those that have programmed the information in have put it in to mislead us. So there you can actually research this. I've done all my homework prior to this. You can actually see that AD 65 and 100 is when the texts of the Evangelion were actually penned. The Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Matthew, right? The Gospel of Luke, right? So apparently these texts that were penned in 18 to 19 AD were an edited version of the texts that were published in 320 AD. Which part of that sounds wrong? Probably the 230 year gap, right? How can you accuse me of editing something that you published long after I was gone, having had it long before? So here you're starting to see some of the discrepancies. And I'm going to uncover more for you, people. This is just the beginning, right? And that's the Evangelion. Now, when we go how do you spell that? Apocryphal. Apostolican. Okay, now we go here and we change that there, and we just the Apostolicans a similar time frame. Right. These were original Pauline autographs, the original letters that Marcion collected and edited. Apparently, he edited them. But that's what the Christian fathers said when they had their versions that had been penned and repenned and penned and repenned and penned and repenned by their church fathers. 48 CE to 62 CE. This is as close to the crucifixion as you are ever going to get to any texts having been penned. Now, Marcionism. Marcionism had, I think they had about 30 to 40,000 followers in 150 AD. I believe that's what my researchers penned. Well, let's see if it contradicts us. Yeah. So here we go. So we're talking about 40,000 Marcions, right? Now notice, did I not open a tab with this before? I'm sure I did somewhere. Let's jump in. So now we've determined the text and the age of the texts and the original canon that was a Marcion text. Marcionism, a small sect in 150 AD, population of sect globally. Let's see what we're going to get here. Okay. Was Marcionism a small sect? And we're going to get to the bottom of this. So we can see that it was considered a major theological threat founded by Marcion Pontus, right? They say that he founded it after his excommunication, which is untrue. He was excommunicated because he was one of the major church holders. In fact, if you went, and you can double check this with the old scholars, if you went into the Eastern republics and beyond, and you went into the lands of Persia, into the other further lands, Marcionism was what they actually thought of as Christianity, because that was the kind of Christianity that was extremely dominant. And so they say a significant portion of Christianity was Marcionites, right? So how many Marcionites exactly were there in 50 AD population? And we'll get a look at what they're talking about here. Right? So I'll try and find that text for you. I've got it somewhere. Saved in a folder. It's just too much to file through while I'm on a live, but we'll get to it. I'll put a link in here so you can see that when they say that Marcionism Marcionists were a considerable um, um, chunk of the sect, they literally mean the majority, right? So Marcionism was such a massive threat to the church in the time of the 100 AD crossover, going into the 100 AD point, that the church was actively doing everything in their power to get rid of him. Now, why was Marcion such a threat? And Marcion was totally Gnostic, by the way. What defines Gnosticism, right? They will tell you that it defines knowledge, right? They will say that Marcion was Gnostic because he believed that the kingdom of heaven was found within, and that one could travel within oneself to find the kingdom of heaven, and one didn't need a church. First point. Second point, he believed that the orchestrator of the world, right, that the creator of the world, the Jewish God, was a false god, and that false god had created this world in a bid to try and use this world to enslave humanity, right? In other words, he had gotten his foot in the door of this world so that he could manipulate things in his own fashion and manipulate humanity in order to enslave humanity. So that's the fundamental premise, which is pretty much in all Gnostic texts, often referred to as Yaldabaoth. Now, there's another factor to consider, right? Marcionism believed that all you needed was faith. And this is why they say, some scholars say he's not a Gnostic because he said that faith was important. Well, let's just draw a clear distinction here. Namaste, how you doing? I hope you're well. Uloma, namaste, big love. Hope the day is treating you sweetly. Welcome. So, Marcion believed that you needed faith in order to get access to the inner kingdom where you would find knowledge. Oh, right. But Marcion, but no, Gnosticism is all about finding knowledge, nothing to do with faith. Marcion taught that faith was all you needed to gain the knowledge of the spirit, which is gnosis. So the whole argument that some people, some scholars try to use to say that Marcion was an agnostic is that faith story, but they don't apply it the way that he applied it in his teachings. And that's really fundamentally important to grasp and understand. That's a fundamental point. Right. Then we saw that the Marcion church was basically abolished. 325. They were completely, he was a heretic. He was banned. He had to go and live his life out on an island under pain of death if he returned. And the books were burnt, other than those that were taken by the church and edited to create the new books of the Bible, right? And so now what happened was most of the texts that you'll find related to Marcionism was actually copied and written about by the early church fathers. They were so threatened by Marcionism because there was such a huge chunk of the population that were Marcionists, right? The Marcionite population was significant. It was huge. And in fact, I would say most of the Christians were Marcionites at that time. And you've heard of Manichaeism, right? Did you know that Manichaeism was using the same texts, many of the same texts that Marcion used? I'll show you. I'll show you the receipts. So what they did was they tried to get rid of Marcion, right? They managed to ban him. They managed to ban his writings, right? They managed to cause his teachings to become unlawful and illegal. And they were persecuted. They were heavily persecuted. Heavily. And in order to get rid of Marcionism, it was a bid to get rid of Gnosticism because the true origins of Christianity were Gnostic. Jesus himself had actually brought this very important, prominent point through his teachings. This is why they had to recanonize the Bible, because the original canon of the Bible was the Marcion Bible. It's the oldest Bible on earth, undisputed. Even scholars don't acknowledge, don't. All the woke scholars, they don't deny this. The Marcion Bible is the oldest, but they say that he edited it to suit his own needs, which is absolute nonsense because there's no evidence of that. The only evidence that we have that Marcion edited those texts is that the later Christian churches accused him of it. That's it. That's the evidence. Other than that, nothing, right? And this is really, really important. And then after Marcion had been declared an enemy of the church and his tradition banned, the church spent centuries writing about Marcion because his population of followers were huge, and they were trying to convert the Marcionites to their form brand of Christianity. Now, what were the differences of Gnosticism? Right, one of the differences taught by Marcion was that the creator, the facilitator, the builder of the church, right, was basically a fake god, right? And that we can't trust this Jewish tradition. So he taught that the Jewish scriptures were to be excluded, the same way that Jesus had said, do not mix the new and the old wine. Put the old wine into the old sacks and put the new wine in the new sacks. I bring you the new wine. I mean, come on. The Old Testament has got nothing to do with my teachings. My teachings will break the case of the old teachings. Break the wine bag will be broken if you put the new wine into the old bag. You need to put the new wine in a new bag. Those were Jesus's words specifically. And this was somehow fundamentally important, and the older Christians recognized it, and they divorced themselves from Judaism completely. Then there was a very small sect that included the Old Testament, and they numbered 1,000, a few thousand, 1 or 2,000 Jewish Christians. Their texts were added to Marcion's texts. Marcion's texts were re-edited. The Old Testament was added to it. New texts were created, like Timothy. Was it Timothy? Later, Revelations was added, thrown in there, in order to create a clear doctrine. And it was formally canonized by the Romans. But this happened after 325 AD. Between 325 AD and 345 AD, there were a couple of meetings they held. The first one was the Council of Nicaea. There were 3 more different councils that were held. Carthage was probably the final one where they had gotten like a very final print of what they were happy with. But through all of the time, they were adjusting their texts. I want you to appreciate that there are more than 7,000 different texts of biblical texts, and they are all different. Go and look at what the scholars have to say. They are all different. They are slightly edited. For the last 2,000 years, they have been re-editing these texts, and the evidence is there in actual paper form, and they are archived, and they are being studied by the experts who can't say that these texts are not edited because they don't all match. And then they use the term, the Christian orthodoxies use the term of the texts were better translated. They were improved upon. They were corrected, right? Not edited. No, they didn't edit it. They improved the texts. They better translated the texts. They did away with some of the complex language and simplified it for people. This is what they were doing. And the evidence is there. So they don't call it what it is, editing. They call it by something else. Sort of like when the United Nations, right, send peacekeeping forces into Uganda or other African states. And the peacekeeping forces go in there and they start raping the children, raping the women, unaliving the men, pillaging, stealing, destroying the people's way of life, completely wrecking the place. And then when they get pulled up in the world court, it's not called terrorism. No, why would it be called terrorism? When soldiers come to your home and rape your children and your wife in front of you and then kill you. You know, that's not terrorism. That's something else. No. So, but if somebody with brown skin from the Far East does something that's called terrorism, I want you to appreciate what we're talking about here. It's about the word. Who throws the word around? If you're like a big government, you get to say that's not terrorism. That's just a couple of mistakes. Okay. But those guys doing that small little niche of people doing that, that's terrorism, right? But it's okay when the peacekeeping troops walk into a public area and start shooting automatic guns and unaliving the public and taking what they want and doing whatever they want. That's not terrorism. Even though they've been sent, they've invaded the country under peaceful means, apparently, because they were given permission by the United Nations World Court. So they're there with a mandate. So they haven't invaded, but they behave like invaders. So we can apply the same ideas. Who gets to control the narrative? So the narrative that we're going to see of all these changes made to the Bible are not edits, but they are blatantly edits. Blatant. I mean, there's no way around this, right? So what happened was Emmanuel, who people called Jesus, which was a name that was also later added to the schedule. Emmanuel was the original name, was firstly not fulfilling the old Torah. He had come to teach a new way. He was not teaching the 10 commandments. He said, do away with the 10 commandments. You only have one new commandment. Do unto one another as you'll have them do unto yourself. But what about the 10 commandments? No, forget that. Old wine. Keep the old wine in the old casks. Put the new wine in the new casks. The new wine will break the old casks. We're dealing with new wine. That's what he kept telling people. So he was totally against the Old Testament. This is really important for you to grasp this, right? And so you can see these teachings that were carried. Another thing that was changed by the Christians at a later stage was the idea of Immaculate Conception. The original documents did not mention Immaculate Conception. That was edited in later by the Church Fathers. And this was a big argument that Marcion was having with one of the other Church Fathers one of the other fathers, I think in the West was having this argument with Marcion, and Marcion was adamant that no, not acceptable. There is no original text that suggests, but there were certain factions of minorities of Christians that were trying to push the idea that Emmanuel, Jesus, was of immaculate conception, because they wanted the man Jesus to be the point, and not what was represented by the Christ. The Christ represents so much more than a man. So all of this idea of the man being the only way to God was facilitated and created by the church. And in order for them to sell this idea to the public, to control the public, they had to make us believe that a flesh and blood man was the only way to get to the kingdom of heaven, instead of, as Emmanuel himself taught, that the kingdom of heaven is already within you. All you need to do is open your heart and go within yourself, and you shall find the kingdom of heaven. You shall find the Father there waiting for you. This was the base and core of Jesus' teachings. So the later Christian church took his teachings and twisted it. And in order for them to twist his teachings, they had to twist the narrative about Jesus. And this is where the problem started. Marcion was adamant against this. He was like, no, you are now trying to edit the old scrolls. This is unacceptable. So he was victimized for it. And it resulted in him being excommunicated by those that had aligned themselves with Rome. This is really important. You see, the Western church, the one church father was having the great argument with Marcion. Let's see, maybe I can find this specific text. which church master had a big disagreement with Marcion regarding immaculate conception or spelling? Anyway, it's done. Too much trouble to fix it. We should be able to dig his name out here. That should be right. So Tertullian was the guy, right? And Marcion was, oh yeah, that's another big part of the discussion, right? I believe the immaculate conception was a part of this conversation. And it was a big part of why Tertullian believed that Emmanuel, Jesus, was a physical man. And Marcion's idea was that the Christos was not a physical man. The Christos was a spirit of consciousness. It was a spirit within us. And that the man was able to tap in and channel that consciousness, but the man himself was not that being. That being was the Christ consciousness. This is like the fundamental difference. And that Christ consciousness exists within all of us. And each one of us has access to that. And that is the gnosis. When one goes within oneself with faith, because faith was what it took to gain this gnosis, one would be addressing one's true self. And one's true self would be revealing this Christ consciousness spirit. So that was like fundamental. Another big part of the discussion was Immaculate Conception. And I'm sure find it interesting that Immaculate Conception was not accepted by Marcion and contested by who? So, okay. So early church fathers such as Tertullian, there's the name again, right? I want you to understand how they hide the truth. Tertullian and Origen and several towering medieval scholastic theologians, including St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Bernard Clairvaux, and St. Anselm, contested the concept. So here we see that Tertullian was indeed one that was contesting this, right? So here we see they say that Tertullian never had a disagreement with him. Was not formally debated. It was not formally debated, but it was part of the discussion. The formal debate was about, because of there not being an immaculate conception, that the man was not Christ, that the Christ was the Spirit, and that the man Emmanuel merely had access to that Spirit that was working through Emmanuel to teach these Gospels. And so this is like a really fundamental difference. And this is sort of what defines Marcion's teachings as Gnosticism, if you really want to get right down to the bottom of it. Because what he's saying is that this Christ consciousness is something that all of us can access, that exists within all of our hearts. All we need to do is go within ourselves and find it. Right. Now, that's enough of that. Let's look at the other sects of Gnosticism. I think we've spent a lot of time on that, and it's time, because I don't want to be here for too long, right? So let's get into it. So here we see Manichaeism, right? Ancient scholars viewed Manichaeism as an existential threat and a massive global faith spanning the North Africa to China. Right. Massive global faith spanning from North Africa to China. Modern scholars long dismissed these early warnings as mere alarmist propaganda. However, archaeological and textual discoveries prove the ancients were right. So this was one of the biggest religions to ever grace earth. I don't know if you're aware of this. We haven't even heard of Manichaeism. Do you know why? Because Manichaeism was Gnostic. This when you're learning about Gnosticism, you're hearing this word Gnosticism thrown around by all these YouTube shorts and all these TikTokers and everybody who read a book that was written by the Christian forefathers that were attacking Marcionism because he was teaching Gnostic teachings, right? That was the whole reason that the first church forefathers were attacking Marcion and why they were attacking Manichaeism as they did. So when we go and we look under the hood of Manichaeism, right? They'll say, historically, much of our knowledge about Manichaeism came exclusively from furious writings of its persecutors. I want you to look at this, right? So what we know about Manichaeism is very limited because Manichaeism, their books were burnt. The Manichaeists were persecuted, the same as the Marcions, right? And as a result, figures like Saint Augustine, who was a Manichaean for 9 years, and imperial lawmakers often categorize the faith as a bizarre, demonical heresy or a localized cult. So can you see that they were lying, right? They were trying to tell people that this is just some crazy little local cult when actually it was a massive global faith spanning from North Africa to China and into the Roman Empire as well. They don't mention it, but it was. So when we look under the hood, right, of this Manichaeism, right? So look at this. I'm suggesting that Manichaeism had many of its texts that came from Marcion's texts directly. They were reading from the same Bible, literally. Now look at how clever these people are. This is a highly debated topic amongst scholars of early Christian history, with no consensus on exact borrowings, though there is a clear historical relationship. I want us to digest this for a moment. Many scholars argue that Mani, the founder of Manichaeism, extensive use of Paul's letters and what they call the edited Gospels of Luke. Those are the Marcion texts. Was directly influenced by Marcionite theology and textual collections, because Marcion was the first to compile an authoritative New Testament consisting solely of the Gospel of Luke. I want to give you an insight into why Marcionism was such a big religion. They lied to us. The Christian forefathers tried to downplay Marcionism the same way that they tried to downplay Manichaeism. They try to say it was a localized little sect. They try and say that Marcionism was a localized little sect, but they have to acknowledge that it was a highly significant, huge portion of the Christian population within the Empire of Rome in 150 AD. They can't deny that because there's evidence, right? But they won't tell us exact numbers. I have found people talking about numbers, but I'm not going to go and look for that now because I think it's highly debated. However, what we can see as a connection between Marcionism and Manichaeism. Now, here's where it gets interesting, right? Let's keep reading. Right? So, however, leading Manichaeism historian and others suggest that the similarities between the two movements might run deeper. So many of our real scholars reckon that the similarities between the two movements, and there are a lot of similarities, the teachings are very, very similar. Rather than directly copying Marcion's texts, Mani and his followers drew upon a broader shared milieu of Syriac Gnostic influenced Christianity. Right? So they are acknowledging the Syriac Gnostic influenced Christianity. That was the legacy of Marcion as he compiled the first Gnostic Bible of Christianity, which was the first Bible ever composed or canonized. They won't say it was canonized because they say it wasn't official. He canonized it. His followers called it canon. Oh, but the enemies of his followers said it wasn't canonized. No, it was canonized. He canonized it. There were 10 books. It was very specific. You can go look it up. If you want the book, I have the book. I'll give you one. There's a great scholar that's actually done a breakdown on researching it, but he's also given you the exact text so you can go read it for yourself. And you can see his commentary. And this is somebody that has researched it for, I think, about 10 years. A language scholar who's done a lot of translation and working on it. So the Manichaeism has the direct link. Now, the direct link, right, to Manichaeism with the later Gnostics. So Manichaeism also believed, I just want to be clear on this, I want you guys to understand. Manichaeism also believed that the divine Christ was within us, that there was this divine spirit, basically the divine Christ. We can call it different names, immaterial. And that we all had access to this divine spirit within us. And this divine spirit was the essence of creation, and that it transcended this world. They also believed that the architect of this world was a false god, and that the Jewish Abraham God was a false god. They also believed that the presence, the spirit, the Christ consciousness was a spiritual element that was within all of us, not a man. They had very similar teachings to Marcionism. Plus, we see there's very tight, very clear connections between them and Marcionism, right? And we can then step forward, and they were also persecuted, and most of what we know about them was written by the church, because all of their writings, most of their writings was destroyed, and people were not allowed to write about them or discuss them because they were heresy. The same as Marcion, heresy. Marcionites, heretics. Then they would have their lands taken, they would be tortured, they would be burnt, they would have their books burnt. This was how they were dealt with. The same as the Marcionists, the original Gnostics, the same as the Gnostics that followed on their footsteps. In other words, what did the Marcionists do? They went into hiding and rebranded themselves. Where did they go? They went into Persia. And the Marcionists went into Persia. They took their holy text with them into Persia. What happened in Persia? Right? In Persia, there was this great sort of awakening of Marcionist Christianity. And Mani, the Persian saint, discovered these texts, read these texts, got awakened, had a spark of gnosis, and started teaching. Many of the texts that he used as his template for teaching from were the same texts that had been the Marcion's original texts. So we can see a direct connection between Marcionism and Manichaeism. Now let's dive deeper. What came after Manichaeism? Manichaeism, they stamped it out. When did they formally do away with Manichaeism? Let's see. When was Manichaeism finally abolished completely by the Christian church? How long did it take them to get rid of them? Right. So I want you to see. It was aggressively suppressed and largely eradicated by the Catholic and Orthodox churches by the end of the 6th century. In the East, scattered remnants were ultimately outlawed in China during the 14th century. So Manichaeists escaped. They went underground. They went into hiding. Many of them went into Persia. They were being persecuted throughout most of the known lands. This is a really interesting idea. I think I want you to grasp how the real Christians, the real Gnostics, have been persecuted. Right. Now we're going to take the next step, right? We're going to step into, we know that Manichaeism was a huge tradition. Now we're going to go and take a look at, now we're going to take a look at the Cathars, right? So the Cathars were abolished by the Crusades. The Crusade was actually created to get rid of the Cathars. I don't know if you know this. I don't know if you know about the extent that the church, the Pope, and the church fathers went through to get rid of the Cathars, the amount of blood that was shed. We are only told small fractions of the big cities. We're not told about the extensive harm that was done throughout the countryside. And you're going to see something that's going to be rather so they'll tell you that Cathars were thriving in the 1140s, right? They'll tell you that they were thriving in the 1140s, right? The sect primarily flourished, right? They got given a part of France, right? But the Crusades of the 1200s wiped them out, basically. In the Inquisition, there were many crusades that were led against them. There have been noticeable whole cities slaughtered, 20,000 men, women, and children slaughtered to get the last 200 clergy of the Cathars. 200, they did away with 20,000. And that was just one of the big slaughters. There were a number. There are 3 big ones. There are smaller ones. And I want you to understand that these crusaders went through the villages. They didn't even add this up. They didn't even count it. From village to village to village to village to village. Where they found Cathar churches, they ripped them down. They mutilated people. They burnt people. They harmed people. They tortured people. People were living in fear. This was Gnosticism, the Gnostics. Now, who were the Cathars and what did they believe, right? And that is in itself rather interesting, because you'll be told that the Cathars weren't Gnostics. What did the Cathars believe? The Cathars believed that the spirit of Christ, Christ's consciousness, was not in a man, not in a body, like Marcion. They believed that the spirit was within the heart. They believed that the architect of the world, the God of the Old Testament, was a false God, just like the Manichaeists, just like the Marcionists. They didn't believe in the Immaculate Conception, just like the Marcionists. And they even had teachings that were very close to the original Marcion teachings that were echoed in the Manichaeist teachings. So they were very much Gnosticism, right? They were faith-related as well as wisdom-related religion. So now I have put here a term, and I want you to look at this very carefully. Look at what I'm getting given, because this is the AI scanning all of the textual evidence out there in various different historical books by various different universities and giving us sort of basic compilation of what they can pick up popular in the world, right? Historians debate whether the Cathars directly read Manichaean texts or primarily inherited its dualistic concepts through intermediary Balkan sects like the Bogomil movement. Okay. While medieval Catholic polemicists labeled the Catharists as Neo-Manichaeans. Right. Why do you think they were called Neo-Manichaeans? Because it was a revamped form of Manichaeism, which was a revamped form of Marcionism, which was the original form of Christian Gnosticism, which was the first form of Christian with the first canon of Christian New Testament. Right? So you start to see how this conspiracy unfolds. And this conspiracy was completely created by the church, right? They wanted to hide this. They didn't want people to know. They felt so extremely threatened by the Cathars. I want you to understand the political
implications, right? The political implications are profound. Profound. So what did the Cathars believe? What was their political ideology? They didn't believe that we needed to be ruled. I want you to digest this. We didn't need kings. We didn't need churches. We didn't need organized hierarchies to tell us what to do. We didn't need to donate our tithe to the church, right? We didn't need to be ruled by the church. They had a form of highly intricate anarchism. Now you can start to understand why there was such a danger to the kings, to the monarchs, why there was such a danger to the church. Because if their ideology caught on and people realized that these guys were teaching the original teachings of the Manichaeists that had come from Marcion, and how do we know this, right? How do we know this? Okay, let's take a look at this. So we've got these historians debating the story, right? And that they were called Neo-Manichaeans. Distinct Manichaean texts were rare in Western Europe. Why? Because they had all been burnt and the people had been persecuted by the church. They tried to stamp it out, but they couldn't stamp it out. It came back. And when it came back, it was called Manichaeism. I'm wondering whether the Manichaean people called themselves Manichaeans. I don't think they did. I think it's what the church called them. I think they just called themselves Christians. So, for example, the John's interrogation, his text of the Bongomol origin, presented the radical dualist cosmology that the Cathars used to explain the creation of the material world. Right? The book of the two principles. Right? So this is their dualism, and the dualism was the fundamental principle in the beginning of Marcionism and Manichaeism and the Cathars, right? They were all dualistic. So let's take a look at the next. What do they call it? Bolgolism. Okay, let's look at this. So who were the Bogomol movement? Okay. The historians generally agree that the Bogomol movement drew heavy inspiration from the Manichaean dualism. Right? I want you to understand this. So the Bogomol drew inspiration, heavy inspiration. That means they were very similar, right? The cosmic struggle between the good and evil and the devil or the demiurge, right? And this demiurge is the foul player that connects the Bogomols to the Marcians, to the Manichaeans, right? And the Bogomol, however, there is an ongoing debate among scholars about whether the Bogomols were a direct continuation of Manichaeism or if they just adopted similar dualistic concepts from other Gnostic sects like the Paulicians and the Messalians, right? So basically there's this confusion. Now you'll notice the secret book, historical concept, context, the inquisitors, basically there was a lot going on politically. People were afraid, and they had obviously evolved the religion, because this is what happens with any philosophical system. Any philosophical system is going to evolve, it's going to change, it's going to grow, it's going to develop, it's going to become more than what it was, because this is what happens with the human brain. This is how we're wired. We always extrapolate, and we always thrive to gain better understanding, to know more. It's part of how we're wired. So let's look at the other sect that they mentioned, right? Who were the Paulicians? Okay, so yes, the Paulicians relied heavily on texts and theoretical frameworks rooted in Marcionism. I want you to read that. So the Paulicians basically got their text from Marcionism, right? And they rejected the Old Testament presented by the Catholics, right? By that church, which was the Jewish book that Marcion had said was not to be a part of the Bible. And that's whole phrase about new wine and old wine in new bags and old bags, and new wine splitting old bags, and they can't be together and they can't be mixed. They're separate. That's it. Basically, Emmanuel, Jesus, the Spirit, is saying you either follow these teachings or you follow those teachings, but they're not compatible. That's what he's saying, right? In as many words. So the Paulicians structured their sacred canon around the Gospel of Paul, right? And a collection of these texts that were essentially brought to the world by Marcion. So the Paulicians were effectively an evolved form of Marcions. They were like evolved Marcionites, right? Now let's step back to what the scholars are trying to say, right? So, however, there was an ongoing debate amongst scholars about whether the Bogomils were direct continuation of the Manichaeism, or if they just adapted similar dualistic concepts from other. So we're seeing now that the Paulicians, right, who we just looked at now, right, were basically adapting the text of Marcionism. And then there's a confusion amongst the scholars as to whether these Bogomil movement, right, which was the Manichaeist development, right, whether they had their roots from Manichaeism or from Paulician. Now we know that the Paulician and the Manichaeist traditions are so similar that the scholars are confused as to which one influenced, right? Which ones influenced the Bogomil tradition. But we do know that these traditions all had big effects on what came after. Now, when we start to go to the other sect that was mentioned there, right? This is the Messalians, right? The ancient theory of the church fathers asserted that the Messalian Euchite sect heavily relied on apocryphal and redacted texts, including the writings attributed to Manichaeans and Marcionites. So you see where I'm coming from here. Do you see how these guys are all using the same texts? And they're trying to tell us that they're all separate sects. They're not related to each other. No, they just were influenced by each other. But they're coming from the very same idea, the same root belief, and they all have the same idea that this evil, builder built this world, right? And that this is the God of the Old Testament that is evil and is not to be trusted. So when you start to look at the roots of this, you start to get a very clear idea of just exactly what was going on. Now we jump to the Council of Nicaea for a moment, just to get a look at this, right? So the Council of Nicaea, Emperor Constantine issued an edict against heretics around 326. The first ones that he banned was the Marcionites. Right. I want you to appreciate this. The Council of Nicaea was held in 325, the first council, and they were already signing documents officially banning the Marcionites in 326. They didn't waste any time. You could arguably say that the reason the Council of Nicaea happened was because Marcionism was such a big religion, and it was so well founded in so many people that in order for them to be able to sell you their new form of Christianity, they had to remove the original form of Christianity that was there, which was Marcionism. So they had to legally take action against Marcion. They had to get him to force him to go and live on a little island so that he couldn't teach anybody, put him on an island where he's like, there's no people to teach, and burn his books and persecute his followers. And this is what they did. So, and the Valentinians and the Novatians, who were the Valentinians? When you start to deep dive, they were all reading from the same playbook. These were all the different Christian sects. And all these different Christian sects, they've given them names like the Novatians and the Valentinians and the Marcionites and the what's that other funny word from further the Messalians and the Paulicians, right? And the Bogomil movement and the Cathars and the Manichaeists and the Marcionists. They were all just Christians. And they were following the original first Christian Bible to various degrees. Understand that they couldn't get access to all of Marcion's texts because they all had little glimpses and blobs of it because Marcion's texts had been made illegal. They were like black market goods. You couldn't just get the texts. So there's a huge, massive conspiracy that was being orchestrated by the Christian church to remove Gnosticism because Gnosticism was one of the biggest religions. What did they say about Manichaeism? Manichaeism is one of the biggest religions that there ever was, right? Let's take a look. Let's see. Manichaeism was one of the biggest religions in the old world. Okay, so what do they say? What do they say? Oh, I'm not sharing this tab. Sorry. Manichaeism was one of the most widespread religions of the ancient world. This is Christianity we're talking about, right? Originating in 3rd century Persia, its dualistic teachings about light and darkness spread along the Silk Roads, briefly rivaling Orthodox Christianity. Now, that's a lie. Orthodox Christianity wasn't able to rival Manichaeism. They had to ban Manichaeism and they had to persecute the Manichaeists in their land so that they would run away in order to supplant it with their religion. The original Christians that were becoming part of the Roman thing only came later when it became an official state religion and all of the Roman Empire started to adopt it. And, that's the beginnings of what we know as Catholicism. So, and so they speak here about the prophet Mani, right? And this is a massive part of Afro-Eurasia. So when you speak about the Ethiopian church and you speak about all these other different churches throughout Africa, old Christian sects, you got to understand why they have Gnostic teachings and Gnostic ideas. Sure, at a later stage, the missionaries went to them to give them the true form of Christianity. They didn't know. Then these other people come there and they're like very knowledgeable and very, oh yeah, you've got those texts. Your Bible is, but you're missing all of these books. Yeah, take our book. We've got all the texts for you. And they go, wow, there were more texts we didn't know. Yeah, the Old Testament. They don't realize that the tradition that they were actually coming from was one that didn't have an Old Testament for a damn good reason. And they only had small bits of Marcion texts because the church had gotten rid of most of Marcion's texts. Most of Marcion's texts that we have today survived because of the church forefathers actually printing those texts so that they could use the texts to prove that Marcion was a heretic. And there's loads of it. And they wrote about it extensively. And they taught about it extensively. Marcion's name was a big name in the ancient times. The church felt so threatened. And the same you can say about the Manichaeism, right? The Manichaeists were even a bigger threat to them. Because when you try and stamp something out of being and it escapes, it gets bigger. Because people realize they must be onto some kind of fundamental truth. That's why the church was so eager to get rid of it. So, there's a little bit of an idea. Big love, Gaz. How are you? How you doing, man? And Vincent, how you doing? I hope you guys are well. For some reason, my chat wasn't updating. It wasn't showing. Mind, time, mind. Namaste. Big love. Big love. I hope you're well. And who else we got here? Kalis, big love. Namaste. So yeah, Kyobi Shaito, big love, brother. I hope you're good. 33 Market King, namaste. And the rest of you, I think I saw earlier. Kalis, and I didn't see class. Uloma, I saw you earlier. But big love and welcome to all of you guys. I hope you guys are having a good day. So yeah, there's so much about Gnosticism that's been hidden from us. All these sects that we've mentioned were all essentially Gnostic, right? Even the text of Marcionism. Yeah, they say that he was focused more on faith. He was focused on faith is the way to get within yourself so that you can be baptized in the gnosis within yourself. Faith was the way to get to gnosis. The knowledge of the Holy Spirit is gnosis. So when we speak about Gnosticism, everybody thinks that there was this formalized Gnostic sect. No, there wasn't. There were loads of different sects with Gnostic ideologies. And all of these texts are the early Christian sects that were all basically stamped out of existence by the Catholics in the Christian church. So there's like a little bit of a round base look at like what Gnosticism actually looked like. And just the horrors that were done against the Cathars. And the Cathars, they'll tell you that the Cathars aren't essentially Gnostic. That's what the modern scholars have wanted us to believe, because they want us to believe that they're all separate little sects that don't have anything to do with each other, instead of that they're all reading from the same bloody texts, as we've seen, as we've managed to sort of display here. We've managed to, to share some of this. So, the Council of Nicaea was really an opportunity to get rid of Marcion and Marcion's tradition. That's how much of an impact Marcionism had on the early formation of the church. Was they actually got formalized because the threat, the so-called propaganda that we were meant to believe was that the Roman Empire was afraid that it was going to be fractured between the eastern and the western sides, and that the Eastern Empire was Marcionist, and that's where most of the population was, and that's where most of the money was. Right? How can they be worried that Marcionism is going to fracture a Roman Empire if it's a very small minority and small group of people? Think about it. But this is what we're supposed to believe. I believe that Marcionism was extensive. I think it was maybe as big as Manichaeism. It's just that they managed to stomp it out and hide it from us. Manichaeism was later sold as being a much smaller movement, but the archaeology has actually displayed, well, no, Manichaeism was massive. And so you'll see that there are many texts that were written later on by the so-called scholars saying that Manichaeism was a tiny localized little sect. But the evidence suggests that they were huge, one of the biggest sects that ever existed, one of the biggest religions on earth ever. And we don't hear about it. We don't even talk about it. That's how well the Christian church managed to stomp it out of existence. And so, yeah, I think that that's important for us to understand when we want to like really get a grasp on gnosis. And Gnosticism is really about that personal experience of gnosis. It's about having faith. They'll tell you it's got nothing to do with faith. It's absolutely about faith. You have faith that within you all of the knowledge already exists. That is a very Gnostic concept to begin with. That within you all the truth is there. You need nothing from the outside world. If you're going to go into the wilderness with nothing, knowing that you can discover all of the knowledge and secrets of the universe, that's agnostic. That's agnostic ritual. Sorry, you might not realize it, but it is. Asceticism is very much rooted with Gnosticism. Asceticism and Gnosticism were very closely allied. Many ascetics were Gnostics. So the early Christians were Gnostics. John lived in a cave, ate locusts, according to the Bible, right? What was he doing? He was an ascetic. He believed that he didn't need any books, he didn't need anything. All he needed to was, he had the faith that if he spent time on his own and contemplated the divine, that he would gain knowledge, the knowledge of the Spirit. And so this knowledge of the Spirit that you gain when you have the faith to go within yourself and to accept that you don't need any outside teachings, that becomes the spirit of gnosis within you. And it means that you will reject the outside world's teachings meaning that the constructor of this world holds no power over you. So I think like that's basically the gist of what I wanted to share with you guys. I've got to go and do some things with my boy, get him sort of ready. What's the time? Yeah, it's 7:30. I've got to do some things with my little boy. Got to make sure that he's good. Sit down with him and watch a bit of something with him and have a chat with him because he's going to be going to sleep in an hour. I'm coming now, Josh. I promised him I would. Thank you. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this little rant that I had about Gnosticism. I think it's really important personally. I think there's been a lot of misconception. And I think the misconception is a massive problem, right? The fact that we've been so misled, I think is a travesty, right? And that a lot of our knowledge has become, unfortunately, how can I say, corrupted. A lot of our knowledge has been corrupted by the religious organizations because they had their own agendas. And it's reached a point where, unfortunately, we're running through this world like the blind, the blind leading the blind, trying to find some answers. And what we end up with face to face is the recognition that the reality the wool has been pulled out of our eyes, and the very reality that we're living in isn't the reality we're living in. I want you to understand the concept of materialism, right? Materialism as a philosophy that has taken root and changed our sciences, changed our histories, changed so much about our worldview, and how they were able to tell us that, all of our pagan roots were just nonsense. We were just being superstitious. It was just absolute rubbish. Human beings don't have the potential for supernatural powers. No, we're just flesh and bone, flesh puppets. That's all we are. We don't have access to hyperdimensional consciousness. We don't have abilities to see beyond the physical, to look into the world of spirit, psychic abilities. These aren't real. This is foo-foo nonsense. How they got to sell this to us is by selling us these completely materialistic philosophies. And the way they were able to sell this was by telling us that the only way to find the kingdom of heaven is by that flesh and bone human being over there that happened to be the Son of God. The same human being that told us all that we are all the sons and daughters of God. What does that mean? We are all the sons and daughters of God. But that one was the Son of God. And the one that was the Son of God said that we were all sons and daughters of God. So what does that mean about all of us? That we're all the same. So, they wanted us to believe, no, that one was from an immaculate birth. That flesh body was your gateway to the spirit. And so by managing to fool people into this delusion, they managed to get us to sort of take on board, well, then the spirit and the divine must be here in matter. Because if that was the flesh body walking around here in the form of flesh matter, then it means that the divine is a physical object. Instead of that, the divine is something mystical and spiritual and cannot be quantified by matter, that it is outside of matter, like we used to believe in the old times. They managed to shift our perspective. And that was opening the way to an ideology which was based upon materialism. And so without that, we would never have bought it. We would never have been drinking the Kool-Aid. We would never have believed the nonsense. We would have always been free. And so that's something to think about, right? It's something to recognize, something to take on board, I think. Just to be aware of how much editing there is in the Bible. I believe there are 7,000 biblical texts. Is it 7,000? There are 7,000 biblical texts of the Bible. Texts ancient. Hold on. 7,000 ancient biblical texts of the Bible. Maybe I have to use these words. Sorry, 25,000 ancient manuscripts. 5,800 copies in the original Greek. 10,000 in Latin, thousands more in languages like that. But there are many other texts that aren't recognized as part of the canon, which were formative to make the canon. And I've heard experts saying that 7,000 to 8,000 specific texts that relate to many of the books of the Bible, and they're all different. They are all, or there are 7,000 or 8,000 texts that are different to the texts that we have. They've all evolved subtly over thousands of years. And the texts are literally different from centuries to centuries after them. So what we've got is not the original text. Marcionism is probably, the Marcion's Bible is probably the closest you're going to get to the original texts, realistically. And it was so outlawed and so feared and so persecuted, you know. And the original Marcion text we don't even have, right? Because those were banned. So there you go. Big love and blessings to all of you. I hope you guys are going to have an absolutely fantastic day. I hope you enjoyed the rant. Sending you all much love, much blessings. And don't forget to smile, because life is really, really, really short. And it's really important to recognize that things are not what they seem to be, right? And that we can't take the Bible on face value, right? Because that's like really, 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 really fundamental to grasp, right? And to be able to take note of these things, I think is really important for us, because then we will be able to get a broader vision, of just exactly where we're at, what's been going on, why we have the ideologies we have, because we might not realize it, but we've all been brainwashed by Christianity that was edited by a group of people that had an agenda. And so it's part of our egregore consciousness, whether we recognize it or not. You see all these people that are out there that are telling you about Gnosticism, they've all been brainwashed by their own Christianity. And they don't even know it. They think they've broken away from Christianity. They think they've freed themselves of religion. But then what do? They go and make YouTube videos and they just parrot the same rubbish that the church fathers were speaking 1,000 years ago against Marcionism, or 1,500 years ago against Marcionism and against Manichaeism and against all of these Gnostic texts. And so they use the narrative from these texts in their videos to tell you how bad Gnosticism is, when Gnosticism is the original Christianity. You can't make this stuff up. This is hilarious if you think about it. Absolutely hilarious. And all of these people that are making these videos, they're all reading the same books that were written by the same people. And these are gatekeepers of knowledge. So there's this huge conspiracy that's being pushed. And nobody knows that they are pushing a conspiracy that's thousands of years old, or more than 1,000 years old conspiracy. And they're repeating it as if it's some new information, that they have figured this out. But they're all false. They're all full of crap, because they don't know what they're talking about. They haven't gone and done the homework. They haven't actually looked at the histories, looked at it, and really broken it down and gone, you know what? How can we trust that one text? You have to think for yourself. You can't believe what they tell you in the book. You need to go and take snapshots of every different thing and sort of put them together like a collage in front of yourself and figure it out for yourself. If we don't figure it out for ourselves, we're never going to know. So that's what I'm going to leave you guys with. Sending you much love, much blessings, peace, honor, respect. Always look for yourself. Find what rings your bell in your heart, and the truth shall be with you. Sending you love from the Bush Whisperer. Om Namah Shivaya.